Ok, sejam bem-vindos a essa sessão, é a Contributed Session Applied Micro 4. Nós temos 3 apresentações, como eu acabei de dizer, a primeira vai ser o Rafael Pucci, depois o Rafael Bruce e depois eu. Só para falar algumas das regrinhas aqui, vamos não fazer muitas perguntas durante a apresentação, só se for clarifying questions. Mas a gente vai apresentar por 20 minutos e deixar 10 minutos em aberto para perguntas. E aí, quando for fazer perguntas, simplesmente unmute yourself e aí você pode fazer a pergunta. E, assim, não sei quem está na audiência, se todos falam português, mas pode ser tanto português e inglês ou espanhol, tanto faz. E a gente responde provavelmente em português, mas tudo bem. Tá, vamos então começar com a apresentação do Rafael Pucci, A Tale of Gold and Blood. Take it away.
Ok. Só uma pergunta, eu sigo em inglês, então?
Acho que o que você preferir, se for português ou inglês, tanto faz.
Ok.
Melhor inglês porque está gravando, viu?
Perfect.
As suas SMS gravadas, acho que vou colocar online.
Perfect. Okay, so let me just share my screen here. All right. So, well, so this is a joint work here with Leila, who's also on the audience. And this is a work in progress, so all your comments will be very, very useful. We're both PhD students at Innsbruck, and we are 5th year students, so hopefully this year we'll finish the PhD. And well, if you have questions during the presentation, maybe you can ask Leila, who is on the chat as well. So whatever you prefer is okay. Thank you very much for being here to watch. And without further ado, let's start. So like the title suggests, this paper is about mining and violence. And we know from other contexts around the world that these two things, they often go hand in hand. So if you think about blood diamond conflicts in African countries, or the Western US gold rush, or even gold rush in Brazil, in Carajás, they all have this element of violence and disputes for the control of the precious minerals. Now, recently in the Amazon, gold mining has been more and more important, and it's often associated with these violent disputes for the deposits. And this is especially true in what we call illegal mining sites inside protected areas, such as conservation areas and indigenous territories. Now, these places, because of the lack of property rights for the miners themselves, often the disputes are solved in a violent way. Here I brought just one example, but if you look in the Brazilian media, you'll find a lot of headlines like this, like violent confrontation in disputes for the control of these mining deposits that are inside these illegal mining areas. Now, we can imagine that monitoring these illegal activities in the Amazon is quite difficult, and authorities would often define this as like a war operation or a tactical nightmare, because I mean, you have to deploy a helicopter, a lot of people, and you have to find them in the middle of the forest. The access is very difficult, and there are a lot of these small miners who are scattered across a huge territory, which is the Amazon. In this context, something called, what would be an indirect source of sort of monitoring would matter to deter these illegal activities. And by indirect monitoring, let me give you an example, such as the VAT tax schemes that you use to reduce informality throughout the chain of production, because you discourage the buyers from dealing with informal sellers, because the buyers don't want to pay more taxes. So they kind of avoid dealing with the informal sellers. So this is a way for the government to monitor the market, but they kind of delegate to the players this activity. In our mining context, this could be the permit system that exists today in Brazil. So essentially, there are these first buyers of gold, and these guys, they screen the miners for permits, and if the miners don't have a proper permit, they kind of don't buy their gold because they don't want any trouble with the authorities. So again, it's like the government is not directly monitoring, but it's delegating to these frontline buyers to monitor the upstream players. So in this context in which indirect monitoring seems to be important, and violence is often a solution to property rights disputes, we ask here in this paper how changes in market regulation, by affecting the monitoring capacity of governments, can affect violence and violent disputes in these places of production, these illegal mining sites. To answer this, we're going to use this unique setting here in Brazil, and we combine two sources of variation, essentially. The first one is a map of gold deposits across the Amazon, and whether they are inside or outside protected areas in the region. And just to clarify, deposits inside protected areas are strictly forbidden. Mining is strictly forbidden in these deposits inside protected areas. The second source of variation is a nationwide regulation that started in 2013. And we are interacting these two things to get our identification. This regulation essentially exempted the official first buyers of raw gold, which we call PCOs, from liability for acquiring illegal gold, illegally mined gold. So you can imagine that this hindered a lot the government's monitoring capacity to control this illegal market. You can think that it increased the monitoring costs for the government, because now they cannot rely on the PCOs to check the permits and to see that everything is okay, because they don't have the incentives anymore. This would ultimately boost the illegal activity and then the violent competition for the control of these gold mining deposits. And the main thing that we find here so far is that these places that are more exposed to illegal gold mining experience an increase of about 8 homicides per 100,000 people. This is roughly a 20% increase after the regulation changes. And we detail this result in two ways here in the presentation. The first one is we show that this violence is coming mainly from violence in the places of production and not violence at the places of sale, just because there's more robbery and more murder and people are disputing gold in the place of sale. And the second thing, it seems that this effect is really coming from the gold market regulation, because we do not observe the same effect when we look at other valuable minerals that are also explored illegally in the Amazon region. Now, here we're kind of combining two different literatures. The first one is violence in markets with poorly enforced property rights. And there are a bunch of papers like with illegal timber, illegal mining in other places, land disputes, illegal drugs, etc. And this other literature on how monitoring affects informality throughout the chain of production. And we think our contribution here is to be the first to kind of join these things and provide some evidence that violence can be a result of changing monitoring capacity in these markets with weak property rights, such as gold mining. Now, this is what we're going to follow afterwards. So it's just a map of the presentation. I'm going to go quickly on this. So just to give a little context about gold mining in Brazil. So Brazil has always been a big producer since colonial times. Today, it's the 10th largest producer of gold. And the Brazilian Amazon accounts for roughly 1/3 of this production. And gold in the Amazon is mainly produced by two types of players: the big international mining companies and these small to medium-sized garimpos or garimpeiros, the small miners. These guys, before the new constitution in 1988, they were predominantly informal people exploring the Amazon. After that, they were recognized as a special type of mining. And we focus on them in this analysis because, according to investigations on illegal mining, this is the main source of illegal mining activity in the Amazon, especially in the protected areas. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one that seems to be important is that these garimpos, they apply for a different permit that is kind of less demanding than the others, whether in terms of environmental licenses or in what we call the mineral prospecting reports. It's essentially, you have to estimate how much you're going to extract from a deposit before you start working on it. Since they don't have to do that, it's quite hard for the authorities to match predictive and effective output. So it's easier to fraud the system here. So this is why we're going to focus on these garimpos. Now, to understand how the regulation affected our context here, I'm going to show you the market structure. I'm not going to give you all the details because there's a lot of things in this slide. I'm going to just highlight some points. So there are two main players, like I said, the big mining companies. They apply for this PL permit, and they can sell gold either to the international market, to jewelry factories, or to the PCOs. These are the local gold buying stores. They buy raw gold. And on the other hand, we have the garimpeiros. They apply for the PLG. And the difference here is that they can only sell to these PCOs. And this is precisely the part of the market that is being affected by the regulation. And more specifically, is affecting the relationship between these two players here, the PCOs and the garimpeiros at the moment of the first acquisition of raw gold. And how exactly is the regulation affecting it? Before 2013, all economic transactions in Brazil are basically under the anti-money laundering law of 1998. That says that buyers and sellers, they have responsibility to report potentially illicit operations if they suspect something from their counterparts. So if they suspect something, they have to say to the authorities. And this includes gold transactions, such as the one I've just described. So in this world, both PCOs and garimpeiros are liable if they transact illegal gold, and they can be punished. After 2013, this thing gets blurry or a bit confusing, especially and specifically for the gold transaction between garimpeiros and PCOs. Because federal legislators, they smuggled, and I call smuggled because they included two articles in a law that had absolutely nothing to do with mining, regulating the gold transactions. And they discussed it for about 2 minutes before moving on. But essentially what these two articles did, they allowed for the PCOs to buy gold from the garimpeiros under what we call the principle of good faith. This means they could simply presume that the garimpeiros were providing truthful information, and they didn't really have to check whether the origins of the gold were okay or not. So essentially here you're exempting the PCOs from responsibility, and now only the garimpeiros are liable for transacting illegal gold. And remember that these garimpeiros are scattered around the Amazon, so it's much more difficult to find. You can imagine here that this opens a huge door for gold laundering, because now the PCOs simply they don't need to care about the origin of the gold when they buy it. And one common practice after that is for multiple sellers, multiple garimpeiros, to allege that their gold is coming from a legal PLG, but it's actually coming from everywhere in the Amazon when they sell. So in this sense, this generated a lot of trouble for the government, because now they can trust the PCO, because the PCO doesn't have any incentive to buy, to check the permits and to validate whether they're legal or illegal gold. I'm going to skip this to gain time for the questions at the end, but the theoretical implications we're thinking about here are simply, okay, this regulation reduced the monitoring capacity, and it reduced as follows. It reduced the PCO's risk or the probability of getting caught when transacting illegal gold. All else equal, this would increase demand for illegal gold, and would increase the disputes for the illegal gold deposits upstream. And then this would increase the violent disputes for the control of these deposits, because now there are more people disputing them because the market is larger. And how do we test this here in Brazil? So we're using 3 main data sources. First one is a map of gold deposits from the National Mining Agency to map the points. And then a map of the conservation areas and the indigenous territories from the Ministry of Environment. This way we can see which deposits fall inside or outside the protected areas. And the outcome variable is the homicides rate that comes from data source at the municipal level every year. And we think that the main difficulty here in this paper is really identifying this illegal mining activity, because in a broad sense, illegal gold mining happens whenever these individuals don't have a permit. And of course, tracking all these individuals without permits in the Amazon is impossible for the government and also for the econometrician. So we try to circumvent this by focusing on the places where they are going to get the gold, and whether they are inside these protected areas where we know that mining is strictly forbidden. This is a very clear-cut rule. So although we may be leaving a part of the illegal activity out, there are some indications that this is the largest part of the illegal gold mining activity that is happening in the Amazon. Once we have these points in these areas, we can categorize each municipality according to whether the deposits fall inside or outside protected areas. And we say they are more or less exposed to illegal mining. And maybe the figure is better to illustrate the point here. So this is the map of the Amazon region. The brownish areas are the protected areas, and the yellow dots are the deposits. And you can see here in a zoom of municipalities that some of them have deposits inside protected areas, some of them have deposits outside protected areas, and some of them don't even have deposits. So we can split broadly these municipalities into three main categories that I just laid out. And once we merge this with the homicides data, this is what we observe.
Rafael, just you have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm just okay, no problem. So this is kind of an anticipation of the result, but as you can see, this red line here is the municipalities that have at least one illegal gold deposit. And you see that the violence is increasing precisely in these municipalities and exactly when the law, after the law is approved. And this gap here, it seems to last over the years. Of course, this is still the raw data. Now we can move on to the regressions to see if this thing survives to including controls and to comparing to a proper group. So here is essentially our empirical strategy. It's a diff and diff, or kind of a triple diff. And we compare changing violence between municipalities that are more or less exposed to illegal mining. And I'm going to focus on the equation 2 here, which is the one that we're really interested at. We regress here homicides in municipality I in year T against a dummy indicating whether that municipality has at least one gold deposit, regardless of whether it is inside or outside a protected area, the treatment dummy for the period, the interaction between GD and the treatment dummy. This gives the effect of the regulation change for all municipalities that have gold. And then we add the illegal part of it. So this is the dummy for all municipalities that have at least one illegal gold deposit, the interaction dummy, and then the triple interaction. These two things here are collinear, but we're just putting everything here for the sake of clarity. But we're really interested in this effect here, which is the effect of the regulation change on the municipalities that have at least one illegal gold deposit. Okay, so just very briefly through the descriptives in the pre-period, we're just trying to show here that these municipalities are fairly comparable in terms of population, GDP per capita, and death rates per 100,000 people. They're different in terms of share of agricultural GDP, and this is kind of expected because these municipalities with gold deposits are probably leaning more on gold mining than the other ones. Now, this is the first regression that we do. This first coefficient here is the effect of the regulation on all municipalities that have at least one gold deposit. We add fixed effects, state year fixed effects, covariates interacted with fixed effects, or the contemporaneous covariates. And throughout the specifications, we see that there is no significant effect of the regulation. This is kind of expected because the regulation is supposedly affecting the illegal part of the market, not the whole market. What we really expected to see stable 2 And here's the interaction between illegal gold deposits and the year done. This would be the effect of the regulation on all municipalities that have at least one illegal gold deposit, and we are controlling for the conditional on having a gold deposit. And here we see that the effect is much larger, and it survives most of the inclusions of controls here. So this suggests that indeed, by decreasing monitoring capacity of the government, this regulation seems to be incentivizing the illegal activity and thus more violent disputes upstream. And just because this is a diff and diff, so it's important to show the pre-trends. This is the first coefficient that I showed, so the interaction between IGD and the year dummies. We see that the pre-period doesn't seem to show a pre-trend before the regulation. And then when the regulation starts, there's a surge in homicides, and it seems to be a lasting effect. So it's kind of a grim conclusion here, is that this thing had a huge impact, and this thing is lasting over the years for the most exposed municipalities. And I have two robustness checks here. I don't know if I have much more time, but I can go over them really quickly just to conclude. So there are two alternative stories here that we should discuss. The first one is, as I mentioned, maybe this violence is coming from the places of sale. So there's more robbery and murder in the places of sale, and that's what we are observing. To test that, we interact the previous interactions with a dummy indicating whether that municipality has a PCO, so whether the municipality is a place of sale. And let's focus here on column 3. What we see is that the effect of being exposed to illegal mining is still here, even when we control for that. So it seems that this thing is happening in the places of production, regardless of being a place of sale. But of course, it could be that it's also happening in the places of sale. So this doesn't really invalidate. It's too noisy, so we can't say for sure. It could be that both things are happening, but then I don't think it's one thing that excludes the other necessarily. And the second thing, and the second and final thing, is maybe this 2013 is just a timing. So maybe it's affecting. Maybe 2013 is affecting all illegal mining activity in Brazil. So you're capturing the general trend of illegal mining and violence. To test that, we do exactly the same thing as before, but now we look at municipalities that are more exposed to illegal mining of other minerals that are not gold, but are also explored by the garimpeiros. We see that after we add the controls, the effect doesn't really survive. So it seems that this is really happening because of the regulation, because it's specific to the gold market, not to the whole illegal mining activity. And just to conclude, so in this paper, we look at this unintended effect of a market regulation that by affecting monitoring capacity is affecting violence upstream. It's a rather large effect that we observe. And we think this is an interesting takeaway, is that these prohibition policies, restriction and regulations, they have to be very careful when attributing the responsibility for monitoring for these frontline players, because as we see here, maybe when you destroy the incentives to monitor, you can be generating very, very serious outcomes upstream. And especially for Brazil today, you probably have seen in the media, there's a lot about this, about gold mining, violence, pollution. So our paper may be pointing to one potential solution for this problem. Part of it could be coming from this regulation change back in the past. That's all. Thank you very much, guys. Sorry for going a little ahead of time. And if you want to talk to us, these are our emails. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rafael. Great presentation. Now we open the floor for a few questions. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and you can ask directly to Rafael and Leila.
Hi.
Hello.
So I have a question in terms of like the mechanism. So you see an increase in homicides, but it can be something that is connected, just like you have an increase of income in these places, and then they're like fighting, or like income might be correlated with violence. It can be violence related to like the dynamics of the market if they're trying to steal spots, or it can be violence against First Nations or something like that. Can you say something about that? Trying to like disentangle the possible like mechanism or the channels of this violence or increase of homicides?
Sure. So maybe I was too fast in the controls, but one of the controls is the GDP per capita and sort of a measure for urbanization. So we're trying to kind of control for that. And I also think that the interaction with the place of sale dummy could be helping with that as well. If it's something that is related to more gold selling, etc., in a municipality, these are the ones that should be more affected, not the others that don't have a point of sale. So I think these two things are helping us to disentangle that.
Do you have any data on homicides against like First Nations, where I don't know, like I know the rate is pretty like not well reported in DataSUS, but is there a way to like, are they killing more like First Nations or something like that? Okay.
Yeah, we could look into the like the micro data of mortality. We didn't do that. But one thing that it's good to point is that we're mixing both indigenous territories and conservation areas. So the effect is kind of coming from both things at the same time. But we could look at that for sure to see who is suffering more, definitely.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, I won't. I'll give some time for other people to ask. I send an email later on. Thanks.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Hi, Edson. Just a quick suggestion. Very nice presentation, Rafael. I think when you're talking about the other minerals, I think, my guess, if I understand correctly, is that these things are very correlated, right? I mean, where you have gold and other minerals. So rather than doing that alone, because actually your coefficients are not that small, right? They're not significant, but they're not really that small. I would probably try them together with your treatment, right? An additional, together with the gold treatment, an additional treatment of the other minerals, right? Just because probably I would guess the size of that coefficient is partly capturing the fact that the location of other reserves is correlated with location of gold as well, I would guess.
Yeah, that's correct. I think it's 75 municipalities have other minerals, and something like 35 coincide with gold. So it's kind of capturing part of the two things. So we could do that, and we could also try to split and there's only those that don't have gold, maybe the two things to see what happens.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but really, really good presentation. Very nice.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
I have just a comment. I know that the data that you're getting for violent crime is from DataSUS. I'm wondering if you have other sources that look, for example, at property crime, if there's anything like burglary, larceny, like anything that you can bring to the paper, because I think that would boost your interpretation that is not really at the point of sale, but rather like in the production places.
So we do, property crime is a bit harder because it depends on each state. The good thing is that for Pará, which is like a big focus of this problem, they do have something on property crimes at the municipal level. So maybe we could do that.
Oh yeah, that would work. Like just to show like for a subsample, results are coming from violence and not other. It's not that like it threatens your story. It's just like it helps with mechanism.
Perfect. No, that's a very good point. Thank you, Edson.
Okay. Any last question? We have time, 1 minute for one question. All right, thanks, Rafael. I'm going to go now for the other Rafael. So great timing.
Thank you very much.
Rafael Bruce, take it away.
Hi, let me just put my presentation here. So I have to share screen, right?
And as I did for the other Rafael, I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. There we go. Are you guys seeing the slides? Great. So hi everyone, I'm Rafael. I'm a postdoc fellow at the Catholic University of Brasilia. This is a paper that's coming from my PhD dissertation. It's one of the chapters. It was kind of in the drawer for a long time because then COVID happened and I was drawn into a lot of COVID papers, more than I wish I was into. And now I'm getting back to it, and the timing couldn't be better. This weekend we had one Supreme Court judge saying a lot of things about compulsory voting. So it's a theme that's recurrent. Every 2 years, somebody says something outlandish about compulsory voting, and the research becomes relevant again. So it's a nice topic to research. So this compulsory voting, persistence and turnout is a solo paper. And well, the introduction here is mostly a theoretical introduction, but let me just say that this is a very recurrent theme, not only in Brazil, but in many countries. I think in 2011, Obama made a rally, and I used to motivate my previous paper on compulsory voting with this quote that he's suggesting that compulsory voting will be transformative in the US. And now we had the discussion already with the elections of Biden against Trump. People were arguing that compulsory voting may be a way to force government to provide structure for a decent structure for elections in the US, because the whole world watched what a mess it was in some places. But the main topic here is related to individual behavior of voters. So there's this long-standing question, and this is a very open puzzle. Still, people are still trying to figure out in political economy, political science, and economists, why people vote, why people get out to vote. It's one of the most fundamental questions, one of the deepest questions in political science and political economics to be answered. And one of the explanations for this, and in my opinion, is somehow a kind of lazy explanation, is of the expressive voting. Because people vote because there's an intrinsic benefit to it. There's this canonical model by Reichert and Arderschuk that simply says, well, people face the costs of turning out, again, the benefits of turning out, and these benefits are some sort of warm glow benefit that people get from getting out of the house and fulfilling their civic duty. This is a static explanation, though. It's not a dynamic explanation. It explains behavior in one election in the same time. It does not explain a dynamic behavior of voters and why the behavior of voters may persist over time, which is an empirical finding in some democracies. In this paper, we try to answer this, and I will try to convince you why it matters to answer this for Brazil and why it matters to answer this again. Because I believe I answered this better than people that did this before. So this is the first comprehensive evidence of persistence as a consequence of compulsory voting in the largest democracy under such rule. Many countries have compulsory voting, but Brazil is obviously the largest one in both territory and population. The extent of the data set I'm using allows me to verify if there are heterogeneous effects of this rule between different educational levels. This is the final result I'll show you. And finally, I'll show that turnout at the individual level is path dependent due to the existence of abstention penalties, but only for those transitioning out of compulsory voting. I will not show you here the results for younger voters because I'm still working on them, and the interpretation is kind of tricky. And we can discuss this later. I'll focus here on voters at the cutoff of the 70-year-old when they're phasing out of compulsory voting into voluntary voting. In numbers, I find that voting in the previous election causes a 60% increase in the probability of turning out in the current election. And I'll show you how I get to this number. The data I use is the largest data set regarding voter participation in Brazil to date. It's a file of every Brazilian citizen with a voter registration from 2010 to 2010. So everybody watching this, I have you in my data set. I don't know who you are, but you're there. And I have information on the date of birth, if you turn out to vote or not in each round of each election, your gender, your education level, as it appears in the voter title, the voter registration, and your marital status. In Brazil, voters have this, I don't have to explain, I think most of the audience is Brazilian, but you have the voter registration, which contains all of this data. And this is the only data I'm able to use in my analysis. But it's, you see, it's enough to get to a lot of interesting conclusions. Obviously, the Supreme Electoral Court wouldn't allow me to have this data without anonymizing. So I work with them to find a way to create a panel to provide a unique ID that allow me to follow each voter, each one of you, over time in different elections. So my data set has approximately 700 million observations. But obviously, due to computational issues, I use only a random sample of 10%, which already take a long time to run. In my day-to-day analysis, I use a much smaller sample than this. And then when I find the code I want, and I use a larger sample. Well, it's a 10% sample, and you see it's more than enough to get to interesting conclusions. There are some identification challenges here. The empirical challenge is to find if turnout in election T-1, the previous election, causes, and emphasis on causes, turnout in election T. The idea of the experiment would be to randomize shocks in their calculus of voting. Remember that simple model I ridicularized in the first slide? Say, oh, this is very simple. I use it because it's the best model available, and it's very intuitive. People have a benefit. I don't know where this benefit comes from turning out, but they have one, and they have a cost for turning out. And we will randomize shocks in the cost of voting for these voters. So some of them will receive a higher abstention cost than others. You see that the RD design will allow me to find this experiment in the field. The current electoral rules provide an excellent opportunity to do this. From ages 16 to 18, every citizen can register to vote, but voting is not compulsory. And this is one of the challenges at the 18-year-old cutoff that we can discuss later, is that I'm not fading, not everyone has to register to vote between 16 and 18. So I have a jump at the 18 cutoff that may be due to just registration and not turning out. We can discuss this later. But at the 70-year cutoff, this is very clean. And when people reach the age over 70, before the election date, they go back into the voluntary voting regime. So voters must deal with these fiduciary penalties, which are small, and a few bureaucratic hassles that can be problematic in the sense that some employers may require you to have the registration, your registration okay, so you have to justify your absences on previous elections. In some instances, you may not be able to get a passport. This affects mostly people in the higher economic strata. But you may not get a loan from a public bank like Caixa. Some of them use for the registration to validate the applicants, because Brazil, you know, state capacity is pretty low, so people require a lot of documents for you to get simple things prove you are who you are. And we have this finding from Cepaloni Hidalgo from 2016, published in Political Analysis. They find that compulsory voting increases turnout in Brazil. So we know these are salient costs. And our paper here basically takes the paper by Gabriel Cepaloni and Danny Hidalgo and expands it. So they have a data set for 1 year, for 2014. I have the same kind of layout, but I repeat it for 2010, 2018, and I'm able to have a panel and see if the effect they find is stands over time. So their paper is my first stage, okay? And what I mean by first stage, so this is a fuzzy RD setup where the cutoff here is the age of exposure to compulsory voting. So reaching 70 years old is the cutoff, right? And I have the age of the person in days, and I'll see if around this cutoff, there's a difference, a significant difference between turnout, between those who are treated, those who are under compulsory voting, and those who are not under compulsory voting. So my first stage is to see what Gabriel Cepoloni and Danny Hidalgo do is basically find if there's a comment here. Someone said something. See, David Levine. Yeah, I'll check it out. So my first stage is seeing if being exposed to compulsory voting in election T-1 affects my turnout in election T-1. And this is a simple, sharp RD. Okay. My second stage, on the other hand, I'll try to see if, and this is the VIT-1 is the predicted value. Okay, is if VIT-1, if being exposed to, if turning out in T-1 as a consequence of compulsory voting in T-1 affects turnout in T. So C here is a dummy which takes values 1 if the person exposed to compulsory voting. V is a dummy which takes value 1 if the person turned out to vote in T. AIT is the age of individual in days in T. And F is a flexible polynomial of first and second order. And I'm following here Gell-Mann and Eben's JBES, which they basically say, well, forget about polynomials of higher orders. You only need first and second polynomials. Polynomials of higher orders may be due to weird results that have nothing to do with what's happening in the data. Our parameter of interest is tau t, which is the causal impact of VIT-1 on VIT. If you remember from your microeconometrics class, tau t is basically the coefficient, the ratio between the reduced form and the first stage. So I like this paper. I wrote this paper thinking about a paper I would like to read when I was a student learning about fuzzy RD and IV, because it's very straightforward. There's nothing very complicated about here, the mechanism, unless you find something complicated that ruins my paper. You're able to say it. I don't find anything complicated so far. So this is the first stage. This is basically what Cepoloni and Hidalgo find, but I use the data from 5 different elections, the first round of these 5 different elections. And on the x-axis, we have the days until the 17th birthday of the individual. So on the right side of the graphic, the person is under compulsory voting. On the left side is under voluntary voting. If you want to make sense of this, as it happens in the timeline of the life of the individual, you can just reverse the figure. So people are fading out of compulsory voting into voluntary voting. So, and in the left axis, I have the impact of this exposure to compulsory voting on turnout in T-1. So I have here a sizable effect of compulsory voting on contemporary turnout. So just let me make this clear. Compulsory voting works. It is intended to raise turnout, to increase turnout. There's no question about it. And one thing that happened to me in my other paper, compulsory voting, and this one, is someone raises a hand at the seminar and says, oh, but the aunt of my cousin in the countryside of Amapá, she never votes. So compulsory voting doesn't work. Well, I mean, we're between economists and political science here. We know that this is not an argument. On average, compulsory voting works. So what I'm trying to do here is expand this finding, is to find, well, it works, but does it change behavior on the long run? And what I'll show you is that yes. So we have here the reduced form with its impact on compulsory voting on previous election, on voting on the next election, the contemporary election. So again, we have a positive effect, a smaller effect, but still a positive effect, insignificant, of compulsory voting on turnout of the individuals. Okay, there's a table of the findings. So here we have the optimal bandwidth in the first column, calculated by the CCT method. And CCT, for those who work in RD, is not conditional cache transfer, it's Calorico, Cataneo, Titinic. And the optimal bandwidth here is around 100 days for most of the specifications. On PenAway, I have the first stage, and PenAway I have the reduced form. So for the first stage estimates, most of them is around 7%. So there's a 7% impact of compulsory voting in turnout decisive effect and this effect of fading out of compulsory voting at the cutoff at this age. I do robustness tests. I do the CCT bandwidth at column 2 there, and I do the half CCT and the twice CCT. I take the half size of the CCT, so I take around 30 days and then around 130 days for the twice CCT, and well, it's pretty much robust and coefficients over all the specifications for the first stage. And for the reduced form, it's a much smaller effect. It's around 2%, but still, it's the effect of compulsory voting in T-1 on voting in T. So there's effect on this. But note, this is a reduced form. It's not an effect of voting in the previous election on voting in the future election.
Rafael, you have 5 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay, I'll be a little bit faster. So this is the robustness for the first stage. You see the coefficient's pretty robust for an array of different bandwidths, around 0.7%. And this is the robustness for the reduced form. Again, you can see that it is robust for an array of bandwidths around 0.025. And now the IV results. This is the real deal. This is the main finding of the paper. So here I find that the fuzzy are the results for the paper, which is the inertial effect. I don't call it habit formation because there's a long discussion. There's a Thomas Fujiwara paper on AJ that discusses what is habit formation or not. And it's pretty theoretical, and I'm not getting into it here. I'll call it persistence because it's a casual term for this inertia. So there's this inertia, this persistence in voting, in turnout, that is around 30%, which is pretty large. So voting in the previous elections causes voting in the current election at 30, increases the chance of turning out in the future election in 30%. It's pretty robust to different bandwidths and different polynomials. This is the main result. Compulsory voting is just a detail here. This is the main result. I'm trying to find a deeper parameter. I'm trying to find inertia in voting. This is it. And it's also pretty robust. It kind of crosses the 0 line there at the beginning, but at the optimal bandwidth and near the optimal bandwidth, we have stable results, and after 100 days, it gets pretty stable. There's heterogeneous effects. So one finding of Cepaloni and Hidalgo that they find is that, well, we find that compulsory voting works, but not so fast. We find that it increases inequality. They find that compulsory voting works more for more high educated person than for lower educated individuals, which is problematic if you care about inequality in turnout. What I find here is nope. For inertial effect, for my fuzzy RD effects, there's no difference between lower education individuals and higher education individuals. I think it's pretty small there, but it's my fault. I did the graph small. In the Beamer, it got smaller, but it's around 0.25 for both of them. So there's no difference between these two economic strata. I do some placebo tests. So for the first stage in reduced form, I try different thresholds. So I take each individual and I say to them, oh, let's imagine your birthday is not 2 days before let's imagine the elections didn't take place at October, at 5th of October, for example. I suppose it took place at the 4th of October, 3rd of October, and let's change the birthdays and the cutoffs for everyone. So I'm moving the election, the distance relative to the election for each voter. Why I do this? Because people may argue, well, some other things may change at the age of 70. There may be some law that says something about the individual. This is more important at the 18-year-old cutoff, because this is an age where people are required to enlist, are required to they are allowed to take a driver's license, and they may be punished by law. They may go to a regular prison, not a juvenile prison. So at the 18-year-old cutoff, this is relevant. At the 70-year-old cutoff, this is here to satisfy the referee. To be very frank, and I find that it's pretty robust. I don't have the results here for the IV for some reason, but it works. Believe me, it works. As it also, I also mentioned, I didn't include the smoothness of the running variable and the smoothness of the covariates based on covariates because of space, because my time is running out already. But it works. It's smooth over all the covariates and it's smooth over the running variable, as previous people who work with similar data found. What else I missed? I think that's it. And well, the future directions, I'm willing to get some more theoretical insight because, well, this is a deep parameter. This is inertia in voting. I have to discuss it more deeply theoretically. I believe this is something that's bothering me about this paper. I'm checking if the persistence varies with upsets and landslides in T-1. So there's relevance. So what happened if I was required to turn out in my previous election and it was a landslide? So my candidate won by a large margin. So the paper of Benders and Martin, they infer a benefit of voting that's related to the result of the election. So if I voted and my candidate went well, I have a positive benefit from this, and I'll take this benefit in the future. But if I voted and my candidate lost, I'll be very pissed and very frustrated, and I may not vote again. So this is something to study, and it speaks to other papers of literature. I need to put a theoretical framework. I already mentioned this, the interdependent fix, and placebo curves I already have. So why is this here? I don't know. I have no placebo curves. So you saw it. It works for different placebo curves. So that's it. I don't know how my time is.
Perfect timing. So now we can open for questions. But great work. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any questions from the audience?
Vinicius wants to bother me.
Hi, Rafael. I just have like a couple of questions. The first one, if I remember, covariates, you have gender as well. So do you have some heterogeneity?
Let me go back here. Is gender, educational level, marital status, and turnout in each round. Gender, educational level, marital status is what they have in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it's just like more, if you have done like heterogeneity by gender, it's just like, is there any differential impact for male or
no,
female?
I didn't. No, I didn't. There are two different heterogeneities that I want to explore. One is by gender. I don't know the channel, the theoretical way to rationalize this. Literature is a little bit all over the place about gender difference in individual behavior. So I will have. Let's suppose I have a result. I don't know what I'll do with this. I know that education has a very solid evidence about the effects on turnout. But gender speaks to marital status also. So if I find an effect in gender, I may want to explore what happens to women which are married, women which are not married, because there may be spillover effects in the household, or something like this. I'm just speaking out, just brainstorming here with you. But it's something to explore. It's costless. It's just copy-pasting the code and changing it.
That was pretty much my idea.
Yeah.
And the other one is just like, I imagine the probability of dying is the same around threshold. You're going to show like you have the graph of like the before and below.
Yeah, it's smooth. Yeah, it's smooth.
So you can do something like
the attrition around the threshold, it's smooth.
So have you done for like T+1, T+2, T+3 or something like that?
No, that is a future direction also. So I can replicate the result, I believe, at a term. I can just take what happens in T-1, T+1 and do to T+2. Just go to the third stage, go to the fourth stage, go to the fifth stage, and so forth. Or I may just do the reduced form of T-1 on T+1, T+2, etc. I have the figure in mind already, but the way I want to put this, but it's something that I want to do. And also other heterogeneity is if exposure to compulsory voting in local elections and federal elections has some difference. I also don't know the theoretical channel to justify this. Besides, it's in the data, tried it, but which is not good enough, I believe. But if a referee asks, the referee is kind of co-author, always.
Well, there are some different motivations, right? So the local elections, you have potential outcomes that are directly related to your outcomes. So I think there could be different motivations. And
Yeah,
regarding the gender, I also thought, like in Brazil, we had, we still have a low representation of women in politics. So it would be interesting to see if, for example, women would turn out more in the next elections, or even like when they turn 70, if there is a female candidate at the time that is prominent enough. So
it's a great justification. Yeah.
yeah, so in that sense, like there's all this literature of female representation and how that affects public policy. I think it would be interesting to see if female representation brings more representation in terms of the voters as well. So I think that would be interesting. Any other questions from the audience?
Yes, may I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Sure. Bruce, one thing that, honestly, it is a comment, it's not a question. It's for future research, I would say so. One thing that might be interesting is that the actual voting threshold, the 70 years, is a policy variable. And we may be interested in either increasing this threshold or decreasing the threshold and see the effect. There's a paper by Dong and Liebel studying exactly this impact. It might be interesting to look at that.
Yeah, I think we spoke about it. And I was thinking about doing a whole paper about this at one time, because it's a very interesting policy question. Should we raise the mandatory voting age or not? But obviously, I'll take a look. I think Liebel and Dong have a different co-author already, and they launched a stated package that do this. An Italian guy, I don't remember his name. But I'll take a look at it with care.
All right.
Thank you, Victor.
No worries.
Edson, do you still have time?
Yes, go ahead.
So very quickly, Rafael, nice paper. Just in terms of interpretation of really what's going on, the mechanism, I think, in terms of sanctions, I think it's a little overplayed. What exists is really the monetary sanction that is small. Condition on the monetary sanction, there is really no bureaucratic sanction, right? If you go and pay the fee, you're done. You don't have to justify it or anything, right? So I would probably try to think more in terms of how this may be framing social norms and what people think that they're expected to do, and something related to social capital and something like that. So the way you're presenting makes it seem that actually you have to pay the fine and then you may have other problems. That's not the case. You just go and pay the fine, in 2 hours you're done. If you didn't vote for 10 elections, in 2 hours you're done and nothing's going to happen to you, right? And I traveling a lot, I missed several elections throughout my life, and it's a if you are unlucky, it's a 2-hour hassle to go to the TSC and get something to pay at the bank, right? And that's it. You don't have to justify anything. So I would actually think of it more in terms of how it is affecting, I don't know, social norms. I don't know exactly what the literature says about it, but I would go in that direction probably.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great point. I think that the social norms argument, it also goes to justifying the fine itself. I think people, the expectation they have with respect to the fine plays a part here. People do not have an exact idea of what the fine is. So if people don't have an exact idea what the fine truly is, and they are risk averse, they may play safe. They may, well, I don't know what are going to be the consequences for me, so I may just turn out. So this is the fine inducing turnout, but not through knowing the fine and people understand it. It's just people interpret the fine in a certain way. But sure, there is a lot of evidence on how this of the compulsory voting law plays a role in social norms. So when people vote, they're voting on a Sunday. They're usually voting on a school in their neighborhood, and their neighborhoods are there. And there are a lot of qualitative papers studying this, that is a kind of celebrational thing. It's not just turning out to vote. It's their neighbors are there. They're maybe monitoring, as the paper by Galton, Rao, and a lot of other people, I think Leo Burstein is also in this paper, about voting to tell others, which is may play a role here. So there are a lot of behavioral mechanisms regarding to what is expected of each individual, but there's also the expectation they have with respect to the fine. So I don't know truly what is going to be the consequence for me. I know there's a monetary fine, but there's a lot of bureaucratic other stuff that I don't know how salient they are, how binding they are for me. And if they're risk averse, and that's me fixing a hypothesis here, if they're risk averse, they may play safe and churn out due to the fine.
Yes,
that's one way to see it.
I'm sorry, but we're gonna have to finish here. So we can stay longer if we want to discuss. But one suggestion is like looking whether the poll station is in their neighborhood or not, and maybe some heterogeneity across abstention rates in particular elections. It might be varying from different locations. But great presentation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you stop sharing so I can share my screen?
Sure. There you go.
All right, thank you. All right, thanks everybody for being here. This is a joint work with Antonio Bento from USC, Noah Miller from the same university, and Marine, former students of ours. This is a unifying approach to measuring climate change impacts and adaptation. So the purpose of today's talk is propose this unifying approach to measuring climate impacts and adaptation, focused on or inspired by a few literatures. First, the macro literature of unanticipated versus anticipated shocks to the economy, the labor literature of the transitory versus permanent income shocks, and also some properties of the free fall of all theorem. And then we study this method to understand the impacts of climate change on ambient ozone concentrations in US counties from 1980 to 2013. There are two major strands of the literature. The first one coming along in 1994, which is now known as the cross-sectional approach, where they leverage permanent or anticipated components of meteorological conditions to estimate the or identify the climate impacts. But suffers from omitted variable bias. But there's another kind of literature, the panel fixed effect approach, which came along about 2007, which exploits transitory or unanticipated weather shocks to potentially estimate the effects of climate. It is not clear whether that's exactly the climate effects, but rather the weather effects. And so it's only in some situations that weather effect could be considered climate effects. So it deals with the OVB, but brings along this other challenge of the interpretation. These cross-sectional studies are inclusive of adaptation, or people believe they would include adaptation because of the long-run nature of the identification strategy. The fixed effects would not, because it's unanticipated weather shocks. So to measure adaptation, what the literature has proposed is just comparing the coefficients that you get from the cross-sectional approach with the fixed effect approach. To the extent that the cross-sectional approach brings, some bias in the estimation of the climate impacts, these adaptations, measure would also be biased. So what we do here is proposing this approach where we just decompose the meteorological variables into long-run trends and weather shocks. And we're going to be leverage both of these sources of variation in the same estimating equation to get a sense of what is the climate versus weather shocks, or climate impacts versus weather shocks, and then using that to identify adaptation in the same equation. And this is possible because approximately because of the Frisch-Wallervall theorem. And this approach has three advantages over previous approach, especially for identifying adaptation. It recovers adaptation in the same equation, so we can easily test the significance of those estimates, but also overcomes challenges of identifying adaptation, in the same location. So previous approach would compare, for example, places with different climate, and then seeing whether, how would this particular location had behaved in case they had the climate from another location, for example. So here we don't have to make those extrapolations. The roadmap, I'm going to just overview the previous methods and our proposed approach, and then talk about the application in the ozone case, and then report the main findings, and if I have time, some robustness checks and heterogeneity. So for those who are not familiar with this literature, the cross-sectional approach is basically taking an outcome Y could be any economic outcome as a function of climate. Let's say X is temperature. And because, I'm simplifying here, we could have other controls, observables, but I'm assuming here that we cannot control for, location fixed effect, because that's collinear with the temperature here. And for that reason, the error term is going to potentially contain something that correlates with X. Therefore, we would have omitted variable bias. The panel fixed effect approach puts that in. So basically controls for this time invariant controls across locations. So what we identify with the X variable is basically through the deviations of that temperature from a climate norm in a particular location to, basically the average of temperature in that particular location, controlling for some time fixed effects as well. So you can see here that we solved the omitted variable bias coming from time invariant factors, but we are not identifying the climate effects anymore, but rather just effects of unanticipated shocks, weather shocks. Now, as I said, adaptation in this two approach would be comparing, the coefficient of beta Fe, which does not include or might not include adaptation because of the unanticipated property of this the shock, and the beta from the cross-sectional, which, because it's a long-run potential identification strategy, would potentially include adaptation. As I said, this could generate some measures of adaptation that are biased as well because of the bias of the cross-sectional estimate. So what we are proposing here is basically, okay, what we would ideally estimate is including the variation that we have for the weather shocks, and also include some measure of this cross-sectional, or at least this long-term variability in weather, which is pretty much climate. And of course, if we were to do this, this is unfeasible. We cannot estimate because these two factors that I'm highlighting here are collinear. So what we're proposing is a feasible approximation to that ideal equation, which is pretty much choosing a longer time span for this xi bar. So it would be xi p bar, and p is this longer time period. And then we would be able to include both in the analysis. I'll come back to the fixed effect, which changes the subscript here in a few slides. So with that, we would be able to take the variable temperature, let's say xit, and decompose it on a parameter, or on a part that is a long-term trend, which represents climate, and deviations from that, which represents weather. So we basically take temperature, observed temperature, and decompose it on a long-term, of a variation versus a short-term variation. Okay, and this long-term variation would be climate patterns, which economic agents could experience and therefore adapt to it. And this other portion, which is deviations from that long-term trend, are shocks, and they, by definition, wouldn't be able to, adapt to those unanticipated shocks. Now, with this, the variation that we use to identify the weather effect is pretty similar to the variation we would identify in the beta from the fixed effect approach. The only difference here is that instead of having the average for the entire period in a cross-sectional way, we are just allowing this to change according to this period P. And using the Fisher-Laval theorem, it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty a good first order approximation for the same variation we would get from the fixed effect approach. But now what that buys us is that there is some variation here as well on the longer term variable. And I'll explain this P in a bit, but what it entails, for example, if this is a month and then T is day, and we allow this information to be available to the economic agents over a longer time span, and allowing some time to adjustments, then we are going to be able to get some variation where we allow the time frame that we include fixed effects on to be a little longer. So S would be, let's say, longer than P. And because of the Fisher-Laval theorems as well, we don't have to actually change this left-hand side of the equation, because that would be a second step in the Fisher-Laval theorem. So in the Laval paper, it's clearly stated in one of the theorems, like that's not necessary, and you can show this in Econometrics 1 in the PhD program. So we don't have to change the variable on the left-hand side. Now, as I mentioned, the reason why we have to change this temporal variation of the fixed effects is because we want to make sure that there's still variation left in this deviation from the XIP bar and the cross-sectional temperature. And so S is defined to be longer than P, and as I said, P could be if T is day and P is month and S is just season of the year, for example, it would still have monthly variation within that season of the year. Okay, now we need the economic agents to have some time to adjust. So this P is going to be, for example, month, but going back in the past, and so you take the average of the same month in the previous 30 years, for example. But you allow 1 year at least for adjustment. So you take the lagged version of that. And in that sense, you are basically telling the agents, based on the observed temperature that you observed in the past 30 years up to last year, what do you do now to adjust? And that's the timing that we are going to be putting forward here. So again, when we get this variation at the monthly level and we take daily observations and we just put a fixed effects for a season, for example, we still have variation left. So this is something that could be tailored to a particular setting when somebody is studying. So if it's agriculture, for example, you're taking growing season, it could be biennial or 5 years or 10 years, for example. Now, with this, it's very clear how we get the measure of adaptation. It's just taking the coefficient of the weather shock, which by definition wouldn't be allowing economic agents to adapt. It's just unanticipated shock, versus the beta from climate, beta C's, beta climate, because here is basically allowing the economic agents to observe what happened in the past and allowing some time to respond to the observations that they have. Okay, so in this sense, we could get a measure of adaptation similarly from the previous literature, but in the same equation. And so we can test whether that's significant or not, which hasn't been done in any other prior studies. And we can also leverage this idea that we are comparing these two coefficients from the same economic agents in the same location. So we don't have to extrapolate. Oh, what would happen in this location if I give the climate from another location? Or what would happen with these people if they experience the weather or the climate from another location? So we don't have to make those extrapolations, which are also some of the approaches that have been followed in the literature. The application here is going to be ozone, as I mentioned, and ozone is pollutant, a local pollutant. It's not the ozone from the ozone layer, it's just ozone in the ground level, which is bad for health. It causes, asthmatic attacks and so on and so forth. So lots of respiratory illnesses. And it depends on formation. It's not emitted, but rather formed by a combination, a nonlinear combination of NOx and VOCs, NOx nitrogen oxides and VOC volatile organic compounds, in conjunction with temperature. So basically it depends on sunlight, and so very correlated with temperature. So it's formed at a higher rate under warm temperatures. And the economic agents here then would be the stationary or non-stationary sources of pollution, and as a direct result of their consumption or production decisions, which are often constrained by regulation. In the US, ambient ozone is regulated by the Clean Air Act. Or it could be market driven. You might be, you might have declining costs of substitute away from the technologies that are rich in NOx or VOCs over time, which could potentially come from, different fuels that you're using or different decisions you make at home or when you go to work or even in the production processes. The application that we are making here, we are going to have daily ozone measurements on the left-hand side for monitor I in day T. And we decompose temperature into these two components, the weather and the climate. We are controlling here for also precipitation levels. And the experiment here is controlling for fixed effect into the location and season by year. So basically what we're doing here, looking at each season by year, 3 months. So the ozone season goes from April to September. So we're looking April, May, June. And in these 3 months, in a particular year, deviations of the temperature from a particular average for that group of days, those 3 months, and also the monthly temperature in the past relative to those 3 months part of that season. So with this, the experiment is that every season by year, we have one relationship between ozone and temperature, and the coefficients that we are getting, beta W and beta C, are just weighted averages of all these little experiments that we are doing every season by year in a particular location. So we control for a bunch of things that would potentially be changing from season to season, from year to year, like, for example, the regulations for ambient ozone. Okay. We use weather data from NOAA and ozone data from EPA, so I'm going to just skip that for now. All I can say is that climate is changing. So this is this solid line here shows that over the second half of the 20th century in the US, temperature increased by about 0.5 degrees Celsius, and that's using the historical data. We decompose this variation into two parts. As I said, we have the moving average at the monthly moving average. And this monthly moving average is basically the average of temperature in a particular month over the past 30 years, not including the contemporaneous years, to allow agents to have at least 1 year to adjust. But what you can see here is that 30-year moving average, and at the bottom, the deviation from the moving average. And the dashed line here is the observed temperature. Just to highlight the difference from the fixed effect approach, in the fixed effect approach, it would be just a line. You take the average for this period and you take deviations from that line. So you don't allow for the variation in the long-term trends to be included in the analysis as well. Just to compare the results, so if we go for the cross-sectional approach, we would see that 1 degree Celsius increase in this long-run temperature or climate temperature norm, we call it, would increase ozone levels by 1 part per billion. Just to put this in perspective, EPA, when they make revisions of the ozone standards, they in general decrease by 5 parts per billion. So it's a fair impact on ozone. If we were to go for the fixed effect approach, which does not include adaptation, it would be much larger. It would be 1.66. Okay, so if we're measuring adaptation based on these two approaches, we would get the difference between these two estimates, and it would be about 0.7. Okay, now we are using the same variation to estimate the coefficient of the temperature shock as the fixed effect approach. So it's not surprisingly, these two things are very, very similar. As I said, it's not exactly analytically speaking, but it's a good first order approximation to it. And so you can see that these are very, very similar. Now, because of the bias that we find in the cross-section approach, so think about like locations where they like warm weather, but they don't like pollution. Well, we would have a negative bias in this case, and that's what we are seeing here. We would increase that by a factor of like 14%. And that would imply that the adaptation measure, which is what we care for, potentially strategy to combat climate change, would potentially be smaller than what we were expecting. Of course, statistically speaking, they are not different, but the point estimate shows a decrease in this adaptation measure. Nonetheless, we can see that both are statistically significant. As I said, those previous methods you cannot test whether they're significant or not because they're coming from very different regressions, and then they don't make the effort to bring them together. If there are some concerns about measurement error, like let me rest assured that here, as you increase the moving average of 3 to 5 to 10 to 20 and then 30, what you see is that instead of like decreasing, if there is a measurement or classical measurement error, you would see a very, very large increase. But that's not what we see. It's barely changing. And so it doesn't mean that this is a factor that we should be so concerned about. Also showing that it doesn't matter like if you get the 3, 5, or 10, which allows us to make some statements about like how agents form beliefs. It could be that they are very myopic, like they just look in the recent past, and that's enough for them to make a decision on whether to adapt or not. We also allow, we are in the main specification, we are allowing 1 year for the agents to adapt. So basically we take the, let's say the 20-year moving average and allow them to 10 years to adjust, or we take the 10-year moving average and take the 20 years to adjust. And what we see is pretty much the same effect of climate. So that doesn't mean that, again, that the agents might be very myopic. We also try to see in a shorter run over in a subset of the data where we actually have what we call an action day, which is pretty much individuals are alerted by the authorities that ozone levels are going to be higher, like try to do something. Well, it doesn't change very much. Here I'm just showing the subset and the interaction. The interaction doesn't seem to affect the temperature shock response, which allows us to say that there's nothing happening in the short run in terms of adaptation strategies. Adaptation, the climate impacts and the weather shocks effects are actually declining over time. So adaptation has declined, but then stabilized. So maybe like in the beginning, there were some low-hanging fruits, and then that disappeared once you get to mid of 1990s, and it's pretty stable as of now. And also what is interesting is, this adaptation is smaller in places with low beliefs in climate change and higher in places with high beliefs of climate change, basically saying that the adaptation could potentially be, dependent on other factors associated with climate, especially those beliefs that something might be happening, so you have to do more or less. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Just to conclude, because I'm exactly on the 20-minute margin, in this paper, we are proposing a unifying approach to measuring climate change impacts in adaptation. We decompose meteorological variables into a long-run component and a weather shock component, using pretty much the Frisch-Frolov theorems and inspiration from the macro and labor literature. We recover a measure of adaptation that is directly derived from the same model, less susceptible to omitted verbal bias, compare responses of the same economic agents, and overcome this challenge of identifying adaptation by comparing profiles of weather responses across time and space. And we apply for an important outcome showing that climate change will bring what we call the climate penalty on ozone, and this is heterogeneous across time and also across different sets of beliefs. I'll end it here, and I can answer now any questions from the audience.
Edson.
Yes.
Very nice. I may have seen this before, so I may be repeating myself, in which case I apologize, but I don't recall it. So when you make the distinction between the long term and the short term, and the idea that in the short term shocks are unanticipated, so there can be no adaptation, right? So we could think, and I think I have this discussion also with other environmental people, because I think sometimes there's a more specific view of adaptation. I may actually know the distribution of short-term shocks, and I may actually invest in technology that would allow me to actually respond in the short term. So I'm thinking about AC, right? I don't know the temperature shocks on a daily basis. I cannot predict them, but I know that there are temperature shocks on a daily basis. I buy an AC, and actually when there is a temperature shock, I shift indoors and I'm adapting, right? In the very, very short term, and without knowing the in high frequency, right? Exposed, I'm adapting. So, in principle, you could have adaptation on these two margins, right? I understand your last result there when you show that there doesn't seem to be anything going on on a daily basis, but that's also because of the specific measure, right? So I think, like, you made a statement that so there is no adaptation at all taking place at the very short term, right? This is true only when we're thinking about as it's captured by ozone, right? Because maybe people are adapting, maybe they could be even adapting in a way that's worsening the ozone because they're using some technology that is emitting some sort of precursor and so on and so forth, right? So just in terms of like conceptually, I mean, this could be taking place at these two dimensions, right? So this is one question. The other one's very, for clarification, I did not understand why you cannot have like I guess it's your time dummy at like the higher frequency. I didn't understand if it's like a theorem from linear algebra or actually just a matter of fact given the variation in the data, right? So
yeah. All right, thanks, Rodrigo. The first question, yes, we are much more careful in the paper about the language of adaptation. We say there might be some limited opportunities to adjust in the short run, and it's tailored to this context. So if you are thinking of other contexts, you have to be very clear what is the short term and what is the long term in that context. And I take your point because, for example, if you have agents that are installing solar panels, for example. solar panels at the height of the temperature in the day, like let's say midday, are producing a lot of electricity, which is pretty clean, like you don't emit any other sources, like not NOx, not VOCs. And by that point, like you might be using, even if you're using more air conditioning, you are not actually polluting more at that moment. And so in that sense, like there is some adaptation that might be happening. And that's why we do the test about the action day, because that would be a perfect setting for us to see whether that's you know, a very relevant channel in this context or not. We didn't find any responses, like, so, you know, and these are like very aggressive measures that the policymakers actually advertise. They advertise on TV, they reach out to people, to firms, to make sure that they are adjusting their production process accordingly. And we didn't find. One of the reasons, I think, it's that we are looking up to 2013. Maybe the, you know, the diffusion of solar panels, for example, was not that large at that moment yet. We tried to see if we excluded California, whether the effect would be different, because maybe California was the one that was doing more, and we didn't find a lot of differences there. The second point is the time variation is more what variation you have in the data. The part that comes from the Fisher-Oliver theorem is to show that the short-term variation is the same, or approximately the same, as you would have thought you would derive from the fixed effect approach. So that's the part that we use the Fisher-Oliver theorem. The other part of changing the dimension of the fixed effects for time is to allow the variation of the longer term, you know, variation, in our case is just monthly, to be possible in the data, right? So if we have season of the year as the longer time period for the fixed effects, then we can have variation at the monthly level. But if you're thinking of other contexts, let's say agriculture, where the growing season might be, you know, what you consider to be the most important portion of, say, like of variation, then you would have to put, like, let's say biannual or 5 years or 10 years in the longer term fixed effect. So that's
but just
linear algebra or anything like that. It's just like what variation you have in the data.
But just to clarify, in principle, the long term component has cross-sectional variation as well, right?
So that's the component for time, right?
Yeah, no, but your long-term shock, your long-term like the climate change, it has a variation over the cross-section as well.
Yes, it could have. So that's why in the defining of P, so we are saying it's monthly, but it's not contemporaneous monthly. It's monthly,
yes.
but taking the past 30 years and allowing you 1 year to adjust. So basically you take the lag of the monthly average in the past 30 years. So nothing is contemporaneous and you don't kill that variation. And that's the trick here, is not allowing that fixed effect for time, which also could potentially give some idea of what's happening overall, you know, to potentially kill the variation of the longer term trend.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? All right, so if there's no other questions, so what I'm gonna do is, you know, to end the session, but for the presenters and the people who might have some further questions, you can stick around for a little longer. I think they're gonna stop the recording soon, so we can chat. It's up to all of us. Okay, I'll be here. Thank you for coming.
Abraço, gente, até mais.
Ciao.
Edson,
Oi.
eu queria fazer um comentário, mas ele talvez seja um pouco viagem da minha parte.
Não, sem problema.
Eu fiquei pensando sobre... há muita gente que diz que as mudanças climáticas, ou seja, o quanto que o clima ao longo do tempo, né, no longo prazo, muda a frequência e a intensidade dos choques. E aí eu fiquei pensando como isso poderia ser incorporado no seu framework, porque, de certa maneira, isso provavelmente você observaria, eu não sei se é verdade, mas mais observações no período recente que você estaria considerando como weather shocks, e talvez isso explicasse a queda na adaptation. Eu não sei, fiquei com isso na cabeça.
Esse é um ótimo ponto. Deixa eu só ver se eu consigo voltar o slide para te mostrar uma coisa dos nossos dados. Eu não sei por que tem isso, só um segundo. Você consegue ver meus slides?
Consigo.
Se você, nesse gráfico que eu mostrei, a decomposição, o que você nota é que e a gente mostra isso no paper, que o choque, ele tá meio bounded. Ele não tá gerando essa mudança brusca nos choques. Então, a gente, basically, a gente diz no paper, olha, talvez seja relevante em outras situações, mas na nossa situação, at least nos Estados Unidos, não parece estar mudando a magnitude dos choques over time.
Tá bom. Talvez seja um período curto também, pensando em mudanças climáticas, né?
A gente está pegando de 1950 até 2013, né? Então, tipo, nesse período, a gente não vê que o choque... Pode ser que mude no futuro, como você disse, né? E pode ser que é diferente em outros países. Mas se a gente fosse incorporar isso, talvez teria que incorporar, por exemplo, com a quadratic, né? Em temperatura, ou alguma coisa do tipo. E algumas pessoas têm feito isso, na verdade.
Legal. Interessante. Obrigada.
Por nada.
Bem legal o paper.
Obrigada. Eu tinha uma pergunta, na verdade, para você e para o Rafael Pucci, sobre o garimpo. O que eu fiquei pensando também na questão do... que vocês estão... O paper está sendo framed no sentido de você tem esse trade-off se você quer regular uma coisa, uma atividade econômica para poder talvez dar um pouquinho mais de property rights, e aí você tem o custo, é como se fosse um custo e benefício do property right, né? Tipo, você torna o property right mais bem definido, ao mesmo tempo você incita, algum tipo de behavior que não é desirable, né, para a sociedade. Nesse caso seria a violência. Eu não me lembro de ter visto algum paper que fale sobre isso. Eu estava pensando, talvez, se vocês conseguissem fazer um framing do paper nesse sentido, sabe? De quais são os custos e benefícios. Porque quando você pensa, por exemplo, no Coase Theorem, ele diz, olha, quando você coloca o property rights, não tem nenhum efeito, né? Tipo, se não tiver nenhum custo de transação, não importa para quem eu dou o property right, vai funcionar, o mercado funciona, as coisas vão chegar no mesmo lugar, na mesma... se eu dou para o produtor ou para o consumidor, é a mesma coisa. No final das contas, eu consigo o mesmo outcome, né? E nesse seu caso, você está dizendo, olha, quando você colocou o property right, você está incitando violência, pode ser que o resultado vai ser diferente. E aí, eu diria que esse é o custo de transação, né? Você pegou, o custo de transação aqui na verdade, essa violência que está sendo incitada, né? Então, quando vocês colocam como o unanticipated, or unintended shocks, or unintended effects, na verdade, eu vejo como uma manifestação de um custo que destoa do que a gente pensaria de alocação de property rights. E esse custo é bem alto para a sociedade nesse caso, que talvez seja, assim, eu não sei se vocês conseguem fazer esse argumento, mas se vocês conseguissem, eu acho que assim, um splash, né? Tipo, vocês dizerem que, na verdade, nesse caso, talvez seja melhor ficar sem, né? Porque parece que funcionam as coisas bem nos outros minerais, que não tem essa mudança na regulação.
Eu não sei, acho que o Rafael também pode entrar nessa discussão, mas eu não sei se eu colocaria isso como property rights, o que eu não consigo entender exatamente como property rights, é porque, na verdade, a mudança da lei, ela não delimita, ela nem delimitou mais property rights, nem menos. Ela só... parece que o que ela fez foi gerar um spillover de garimpeiros de áreas em que potencialmente eles poderiam ter property rights para áreas que eles não têm como ter property rights de maneira alguma. Então, talvez seja nesse sentido que você está comentando property rights,
Assim, como eu disse, eu não sei exatamente como elaborar, porque eu não sei muito bem a situação que vocês estão, todos os detalhes da situação que vocês estão trabalhando, mas se tivesse como fazer um frame em property rights, e aí você está analisando quais são os custos de você fazer essa alocação, eu acho que seria bem interessante, porque todos os papers que você vê, por exemplo, o Barbed Wire paper, né, no QJE, eles simplesmente dizem, quando você teve o Barbed Wire, você conseguiu separar as propriedades e você aumentou o investimento, né? E aí foi aquele benefício para a sociedade, mas nenhum custo, porque foi uma tecnologia que trouxe, né? Trouxe o Barbed Wire, você simplesmente usou a tecnologia, agora você já não tem mais esse custo de investir, porque você pode investir e proteger o seu investimento. Nesse caso de você, se eu entendi um pouco, bom, assim, eu não sei se eu entendi completamente pelo que você falou, Leida, talvez eu entendi exatamente o oposto, né? Que eles estão indo para uma situação de menos property right. E aí, se for esse o caso, daí é na mesma direção do Barbed Wire, né? Quando você reduz property rights, você vai trazer esses custos, e nesse caso é em torno de violência.
Então eu acho que eles estão indo na direção de menos property rights, porque exatamente nessa situação em que a gente está colocando que eles são mais expostos ao illegal mining, aí de fato não é possível obter uma permissão para explorar o ouro, né? E no caso dos outros municípios em que tem jazidas, mas não tem, essas jazidas não estão em terras de conservação, terras indígenas, etc., aí sim há como definir direitos de propriedade, né? Apesar de nem sempre eles estarem definidos.
Isso. Não, então, eu acho que seria assim, eu acho que seria muito, muito proveitoso para vocês, talvez, fazerem um frame nessa direção, sabe? Porque eu acho que as pessoas têm um interesse intrínseco em property rights. E se esse é o caso, que não, você reduziu property rights, você está gerando um custo surrealmente grande para a sociedade, porque realmente nos crimes violentos é muito alto, né? Tipo, 20% é muito alto. E aí, tipo, talvez quantificar, então, né? Qual foi? Você pode pegar o Value of Statistical Life, talvez algum paper do Rodrigo, e tentar, né? Tipo, o custo para essa região foi disso. O quanto você, em termos de homicides, né? Tipo, você vê quantos tiveram, e aí, tipo, você usa o VSL para poder dar um valor, né? Para a sociedade, o custo foi disso. Para tirar esse property right, foi esse o custo. Eu acho que, assim, várias pessoas iriam gostar de ver o paper por essa razão também, né? Tipo, porque tem um monte de gente que vai adorar ver um paper que mostre isso, né? Tipo, que gerou um custo tão alto, que é um custo em termos de vidas, nesse caso.
Sim.
A outra coisa que eu queria fazer um eco que o Rodrigo falou, que é a questão dos outros minerais, que eu acho que nail down essa margem de explicação vai ser importantíssima para vocês. E assim, ou vocês interagem tudo, coloca gold e não gold na mesma equação, e aí diz, vamos comparar as diferenças aqui, né? Tipo, vamos ver qual é o coeficiente disso versus aquilo, testa para ver se é diferente, entendeu? Ou pega municípios que só tenham uma coisa ou outra, para ver até que ponto esse efeito do non-gold minerals não tem. Porque se vocês ter uma coisa bem clean, e aí, assim, tenta ver nos dados como é que você pode fazer. Talvez regiões, por exemplo, no paper que eu tenho, eu queria ver um efeito de eletricidade em alguns outcomes. E vários lugares que eu estava estudando coal plants, né, termoelétricas poluidoras, versus hidrelétricas, que não seriam poluidoras, digamos assim. A gente não conseguiu achar nada enquanto não isolou lugares que tinha só coal ou só hidrelétricas. E aí você viu o efeito completamente, assim, você via que o efeito de hidrelétricas era beneficial,
Beneficial. That's great.
Nos lugares que não tinha coal, e nos outros lugares, como tinha coal, ele desaparecia. Então, assim, pode ser que tenha um spillover tão grande. Então, assim, tenta ver como é que vocês podem pegar os dados e tentar, assim, eliminar qualquer spillover que possa ter de gold para outras coisas, para ver se o efeito reduz em termos da point estimate. Porque, assim, se vocês mostrarem que o efeito seria ou é economicamente muito pequeno, ou você conseguia distinguir alguma coisa, talvez você tem que colocar tudo na mesma equação e aí você consegue testar se o coeficiente é diferente, né? Mostrar que nem se não for zero, entendeu, o coeficiente. Se for diferente, já é uma coisa. Que você pode falar, olha, em outros minerais pode estar acontecendo alguma outra coisa, mas a diferença aqui é estatisticamente significante. E a gente pode dizer alguma coisa sobre isso. A outra coisa é se o efeito é próximo de zero, aí você pode dizer, olha, é próximo de zero, não tem muita coisa. Porque eu acho que esse robustness check vai ser crucial para vocês, assim. Então, assim, o que vocês puderem fazer para poder ver como é que essa... Ou é subsamples, ou é algumas localidades versus outras, ou faz algum tipo de breakout das observações para ver se vocês conseguem isolar um pouco do spillover, se está tendo algum spillover, né? Eu, na verdade, fico surpreso que o efeito que vocês estão encontrando, não, assim, se eu entendi aquela equação certa, eu acho que eu entenderia como spillover aquela estimativa, né? Tipo, que é a point estimate ainda é alta, né? Não é estatística significante, mas eu talvez entenderia como uma tipo, se você tem no mesmo município gold e não gold, pode ser que você está masqueando o efeito, né? Tipo, de um para o outro. E aí que você está capturando, na verdade, não é os outros minerais, é simplesmente como o ouro gerou esse spillover de violência para as outras coisas também. Porque você pode, o garimpeiro pode dizer, agora eu não vou ter mais o lucro disso, eu vou tentar outra coisa. Então, gera um certo spillover, tipo, no mesmo lugar. Então, por isso que eu falei, acho que talvez separando os dados vai dar uma coisa um pouquinho melhor. A outra coisa que eu queria falar, é uma coisa que eu fiz num paper meu quando uso de científico, que as pessoas gostaram, é tentar fazer um placebo que você coloca os anos, desde todos os anos que você tem na amostra, assim, sabe? Ou quase todos, e mostra um gráfico. Simplesmente fala assim, olha, se eu fizer o gráfico, o ponto maior aqui é esse. É exatamente quando houve a mudança na regulação.
Certo.
Tipo, disso se atribuem a cada... Foi em 2013, vou colocar em 2012, 2011, 2010, tipo, todos os anos você vai ver que o efeito começa em zero, vai ficar ou positivo, né, com o tempo, em termos de violência, e vai reduzir de novo, como você esperaria, entendeu? E aí você fala, esse aqui é exatamente o ponto onde a lei tá mudando. Como se fosse assim, os dados estão te dizendo exatamente quando aconteceu.
Sim.
E aí coincide com o ponto da legislação.
Tá. É uma boa.
Legal.
Uma boa.
Obrigada.
Muito obrigado.
É isso, mas foi muito
Sempre
bom.
bom ouvir sugestões.
Sim.
Pro Rafael Bruce, você tá aí ainda, Rafael? Tá, ok. Uma coisa que eu queria falar para você é, quando eu olho o segundo estágio da sua estratégia, eu fiquei um pouquinho confuso na seguinte maneira. A descontinuidade no primeiro estágio é digamos assim, é 70 anos, né? Tipo, um pouquinho mais dias, menos dias ali ao redor de 70 anos. Quando eu vou de uma eleição para outra, mecanicamente eu vou pelo menos 2 anos, né? A não ser que o que eu fiquei pensando, tipo, esses 2 anos pode ter uma série de coisas que estão acontecendo, né? Que geraria talvez alguma descontinuidade, mesmo que tipo, tem uma imperfeição na descontinuidade ainda ali, né? Tipo, que está 2 anos da sua descontinuidade de 70 anos. Então, assim, eu entendo, mesmo na reduced form, ou mesmo no segundo estágio, como se fosse um efeito, como que pode dizer? Lagged, entendeu? Tipo, daquela descontinuidade, mas que, tipo, então não é via o turnout, é simplesmente diretamente da descontinuidade. Simplesmente, tipo, se eu fosse pegar uma bandwidth que vai pegando longo período, que inclui, por exemplo, 2 anos, a outra eleição já estaria dentro dessa bandwidth. Então, assim, alguma coisa que eu fiquei pensando foi talvez mudar. E se você pega a eleição presidencial, só pega a próxima eleição presidencial. Se você pega a eleição municipal, pega só a próxima municipal. Para você ficar mais distante uma da outra. Tudo bem, vai ter essa história que vai ser meio blurry, né? Que tem uma outra eleição ali no meio. Mas se não for a especificação principal, pelo menos colocar isso como, olha, se você está preocupado que a mesma descontinuidade pode ainda estar valendo quando você está pensando 2 anos depois, o que foi reassuring para mim foi ver a bandwidth, né? Que você vê que fica bem estável depois que você chega, acho que é 150 dias, alguma coisa do tipo.
É 100.
100 dias, ok.
100 dias.
100 dias fica bem estável, né? Então, acho que isso ajuda pra caramba em termos desse longo período. Agora, a outra coisa que me deixou um pouco preocupado foi esse movimento do próximo. Porque imagine um lugar que tem segundo turno, né? A pessoa tem que voltar no segundo turno. E esse noise que você está tendo ali, quando a bandwidth está bem próxima, me deixou assim, será que você consegue olhar, por exemplo, só para as capitais, onde tem segundo turno? Só para lugares que tem segundo turno?
Consigo, não, eu consigo, é que tem vários jeitos de fatiar a coisa. Eu, por enquanto, estou assumindo que não tem nenhuma diferença sistemática ao redor do bandwidth nessas dimensões que você mencionou, tanto do segundo turno, quanto das coisas que acontecem da primeira eleição em T-1 e T. Então, imaginando que, de T-1 em T, a única diferença desses caras, né, é a exposição à obrigatoriedade de voto ali no cutoff. O resto, na média, é igual. Vai ter coisa acontecendo ali, mas na média, quando subtrai, vai ser igual. Isso eu estou assumindo. É uma coisa que, ao rodar a regressão sem levar em conta essas coisas, eu estou embutindo como hipótese.
Nessa eleição que você está pegando, de 70, você está pegando o primeiro turno?
Primeiro turno. Eu faço tudo primeiro turno. Eu posso fazer um ultra short term. Eu posso pegar tipo, tudo que tem segundo turno, pegar quem era obrigado a votar no primeiro turno e quem não era, e tinha título, e no segundo turno ver como votou. Ver se compareceu ou não. É o ultra short term. Eu imagino que o efeito vai ser super alto.
Isso parece ser bem legal, gostei dessa ideia.
Eu acho que ficaria bem legal, assim, sabe? Pegando esse very, very short... Porque do primeiro turno ao segundo turno não é um mês, mais ou menos, ou 20...
É um mês. É dentro do mesmo mês. É dentro do mesmo mês.
15 dias. É 2 semanas.
Isso.
Porque, assim, eu acho, olhando esse very, very short term, assim, eliminaria uma série de coisas na minha cabeça. Se você conseguisse mostrar que tem... Ou é diferente o efeito se você votou no primeiro, ou foi compulsório no primeiro, mas não no segundo, ou foi nos dois, e você votou nos dois. Tipo, eu acho que ajudaria um pouco na questão da persistência, da história da persistência.
Entendi. Eu imagino que eu vou rodar esse negócio, porque é o que eu falei, esse paper foi da tese, eu entreguei a tese da pandemia, aí eu tive uma ressaca de tese.
Mas assim, eu acho que você tá numa ótima... Tipo, eu li o seu outro paper que foi publicado no JD e eu achei super bacana, na verdade, sobre a questão do voter turnout, de prestar atenção, né, na notícia. Acho que é bem relevante, assim. E os dados que você tem também são ótimos, né, no sentido que você tem todos. Então, assim, acho que como você tem observações, por isso que eu tô falando, você tem observações para fazer essa coisa bem de short term, você tem, se eu entendi direito, 700 milhões de observações. Eles não vão te dar tudo, mas você pega...
Não, é tudo. Eu pego todos os eleitores em todas as eleições. Então, você multiplica, vai somando o cara ali tudo, vai 700 mil.
Eu iria um pouco... A outra coisa que eu fiquei pensando, eu já te falei sobre isso, tem a eleição da Dilma nesse período, não tem?
Tem? Não lembro agora. Calma aí. Eu tomei café só agora. Eu tomei devagar. Teve eleição da Dilma.
Eu acho que a questão de gênero, eu acho que tem que puxar um pouco mais isso.
Não, isso eu fico pensando, será que é um paper à parte? Porque é isso que o Vitor levantou agora, de ver a estratégia do Liebel, de a sensibilidade do impacto, a mudança de cutoff. Para mim, isso é um paper, isso que eu conversei com o Possebon já. Tem essa coisa do gênero, que também, tipo, será que eu sou obrigado a votar? E nessa eleição que eu fui obrigado a votar, uma mulher foi eleita. Será que na próxima eleição, eu sei como saber o gênero ainda, tem que interagir o gênero do candidato que foi eleito, o gênero do eleitor, e ver se tem inércia, ou ver se tem comparecimento. Que são umas lacunas que o paper do Hidalgo deixou vazio, assim, que ele não cobriu.
Porque eu acho que, assim, com a questão do gênero, com a eleição da Dilma, eu acho que é tão único isso, sabe? Tipo, que você consegue ver a questão de... Porque eu tô falando isso porque, assim, se você falar sobre gênero para a eleição dos Estados Unidos, é o que todo mundo fala. Porque todo mundo sabe que se as mulheres votarem nas eleições, o Partido Democrata ganha mais votos. assim, é uma coisa que todo mundo sabe na dinâmica, que tem essa coisa de gênero que é super... Por que que o Trump tava tão assim, ai, mulheres, por favor, votem em mim? Tipo, ele falou isso claramente em comícios.
É,
Por quê? Porque eles sabem que se o turnout de mulheres for mais alto, a participação mais alta de mulher implica em maior número de votos para os democratas. Então, assim, eu acho que tem uma... E eu acho que isso não é dos Estados Unidos apenas, é que mulher presta mais atenção nas políticas que as pessoas estão fazendo. Que é o
é a
paper
história,
da
é a história do...
né?
É,
Tipo, de política policy makers, né? Women as policy makers. Então, assim, com a eleição, se a eleição de Dilma tiver aí na sua base, assim, eu investiria bastante nesse aspecto, porque eu acho que vai, essa questão de gênero vai ser muito, muito interessante para você.
legal, Edson. Vou pensar. É porque isso, a base é muito grande, eu tô meio que... Esse paper da inércia era a coisa mais imediata que, tipo, era uma coisa behavioral que eu tava a fim de fazer, e era coisa assim, porra, tem um painel, uma pergunta que ninguém respondeu nesse negócio, mas tem esses outros papers mais legais de fazer que estão no meu radar ainda para fazer com esses dados.
Uma outra coisa que eu queria te perguntar, você não tem a informação de cor, raça, não, né?
Não tenho. Eu tenho só o que... É uma zona, né? O TSE meio cagado. Porque eles têm o dado e só aparece na minha base quem tem título. Então, toda a informação que eu tenho é informação que tem no título dos caras. Então, mesmo para anonimizar os caras, é anonimização em relação ao título do leitor. Então, a informação que eu tenho é só... tudo que tem no título tá ali. Mas é só isso que tem no título. O lance só tem estado civil, gênero e educação. Educação é super problemática. Porque ninguém atualiza o título.
Entendi.
É super problemática a educação. Eu uso assim, porque eu tô assumindo que, de novo, sistematicamente, no threshold não tem grandes mudanças de estar problemático a educação ali.
Sim.
Mas eu entendo que tem muito ruído.
Uma coisa que eu queria te perguntar é se você tem, mesmo no acesso confidencial, o CPF das pessoas ou não.
Se eu tivesse, eu não estaria fazendo esse paper. Eu estaria fazendo um paper juntando raios, um monte de coisa.
Exatamente. Na verdade, o que eu pensei foi, na verdade, o programa
Cadastro único?
Bolsa Família ou alguma coisa, cash transfer. Porque eu acho assim, tem esses papers todos, né? Tipo, até no Uruguai, eu acho que foi o último paper que eu vi no AJ Applied, eu acho. Que eles falam que as pessoas que pegavam o programa votavam mais pro digamos, o presidente que colocou essa política em place, né? Tipo, mas eu acho que é tudo no agregado, eles não têm microdados, entendeu?
No Brasil tem um paper que faz isso.
Tem?
Tem o capítulo da tese do Valdemar Pinho, foi com a Cecília Machado, na PGE. Okay. Ele apresentou no READ, eu acho. Eu tava nesse READ apresentando aquele JD lá, e ele apresentou, a Cecília apresentou esse paper, na verdade. Que o que eles fazem, eles têm a mesma base de dados que eu tenho, mais ou menos, para um ano, e eles olham na sessão eleitoral. Então, eles têm no cadastro único a densidade de recipientes de programas do governo ao redor daquela sessão.
Entendi.
Então, eles veem a coisa indireta. Tem muita gente que vota essa sessão, essa sessão votou muito no Lula. Isso. Mas não tem como linkar o beneficiário
por isso que eu
ao
acho
cara.
Que o seu dado
seria
muito mais preciso. Assim, se você tiver uma linha para tentar fazer o matching, eu iria numa linha dessas. Porque tem, tipo, a Joana e o François, eles conseguiram juntar a Bolsa Família com a nota fiscal paulista, por exemplo, ou a RAIS, entendeu? Tipo, tudo via CPF. Então, se você tivesse uma possibilidade, assim, eu acho que seria assim, a coisa mais clara que você pode ter, né? Que é o eleitor participando ou não, se o eleitor é beneficiário ou se a família é beneficiária, né? Outra questão que eu me veio à cabeça, que isso, assim, foi uma coisa minha, porque, tipo, eu mudei do Brasil faz, sei lá, 13 anos, eu acho, 13, 14 anos. Por um tempão, eu era registrado como eleitor na minha cidade natal, onde meus pais ainda moram. Então, assim, eu abstive das eleições, tipo, como o Rodrigo falou, eu tive que ir, né, no fórum, e aí quando eles souberam que eu estava morando fora do país, eles nem me cobraram a taxa, entendeu? Tipo, que era acho que era R$10, alguma coisa, aí não me lembro. Assim,
3, é bem barato, é 3,
baixo, assim,
é bem barato.
Não tem, a penalização não é praticamente nada, mas o que meu pai me disse foi que nos anos seguintes, em alguns dos anos, teve uma, como que eles falaram, era
biometria.
alguma coisa que, tipo, que me excluíram da lista, entendeu?
Hum.
De eleitores, porque eu não estava lá para poder fazer o negócio. E meu pai disse que diminuiu, na minha cidade tem poucos eleitores, né? Tipo, é uma cidade pequenininha, uma vila, assim. Diminuiu quase 20% o número de eleitores. No registro lá, sei lá como que eles chamaram. E assim, meu pai disse que mudou um pouco o cenário eleitoral no município, entendeu? De prefeitos, digamos assim. Porque aquelas pessoas vinham simplesmente porque tinham interesses ligados a um partido ou outro. Era bastante desproporcional, né? Então, assim, eu acho que talvez olhar essa mudança na lei com os seus dados seria bem interessante de ver como é que isso... Assim, é totalmente diferente não é para esse paper, estou falando outras ideias para você com essa base de dados, que eu acho que você tendo os microdados, você consegue ver até que ponto há essa mudança dos eleitores, né? Tipo, você vê, por exemplo, um eleitor que está abstendo da votação por vários anos, de repente aparece numa outra localidade, ou aparece logo depois dessa biometria, você fala, esse eleitor devia estar simplesmente não votando porque não estava morando naquela localidade, né? E como isso afetou a eleição municipal? Eu focaria em eleição municipal, porque eu acho que isso vai ser, especialmente cidade pequena, assim, acho que isso seria o mais interessante, assim, para ver.
E o legal dessa base é que, assim, tem como acompanhar a migração. Eu tenho migração na base. Então,
Essa é uma coisa fantástica, né? Que você vê onde as pessoas estão indo.
Migração na base é quando o cara vai no fórum e troca o título. Eu não sei se... mas o que dá para fazer na base é isso. Eu consigo acompanhar a migração dos caras em cidades. Então, dá para pensar em uma coisa à la Léa Bustan, assim, de o cara tá migrando para um município que é muito diferente do que ele saiu, e o que aconteceu no município que saiu, que depois que essa massa migrou.
Mas é por isso que você precisa uma variação exógena, que vai ser a biometria, entendeu? Porque você diz, olha, não é que a pessoa decidiu, ela foi...
excluída.
Né, excluída, ela teve que se registrar. Eu fui excluído, eu tive que renovar o passaporte, quando eu só descobri que eu tinha sido excluído quando eu fui renovar o passaporte. Falaram, não, você não está em dia com o sistema eleitoral. Assim, como assim? Tipo...
Cadê o Rodrigo agora para ouvir?
Então, o que aconteceu foi que eu tive que me registrar. Imagina, eu estava em São Paulo, na cidade de São Paulo, meus pais moram 600 quilômetros de São Paulo, da cidade de São Paulo. Então, não dava tempo de eu voltar para fazer o registro lá e voltar a pegar meu passaporte. Então, eu liguei para uma amiga que mora em São Paulo e ela falou, não, pode deixar, escrever uma carta que você está morando comigo. Assim, eu nem sei qual é a escola, que é a zona eleitoral que eu sou, entendeu, atualmente. Porque, tipo, foi só para eu pegar o novo título e pegar meu passaporte. Tipo, porque senão eu não conseguia pegar o passaporte. Então, assim, eu não faço a menor ideia. Tipo, esses dias me perguntaram onde é que eu voto. Eu falei, não sei, em algum lugar em São Paulo, né? Mas, tipo, faz tempo que eu não voto, então, né, no Brasil. Então, agora que eu tô tentando mudar o meu título para cá, né? Porque eu só votaria para presidente, mas pelo menos eu não fico nessa coisa de quando tiver que renovar passaporte, ficar, né, doido buscando, porque tem essa regra de 6 meses, né? Você tem que estar 6 meses no lugar para poder mudar o título, né? Tipo, então... Mas, enfim, assim, eu acho que é uma base fantástica. Então, acho que tem várias perguntas para responder ali. Uma outra coisa que eu fiquei pensando foi o plebiscito de desarmamento. Não sei se está na sua base ou não.
Nossa, para mim, eu acho que o meu grande graal, inclusive, vocês estão estudando meio ambiente, ouro, eu penso muito nisso, nessas coisas de plebiscito, porque tem 2 plebiscitos que eu quero olhar. O desarmamento, mas esse eu já vi, não tem microdado nível individual, mas tem um de votação, que é o de separação do Pará, que é um lugar cheio de minas de ouro, e foi uma votação super esquisita. Porque eu cheguei a fazer isso para matéria de economia urbana no doutorado, com o Danilo Ilioli, era. Meio que abandonei esse projeto. Mas era uma coisa assim, Belém votou para ficar e todo o resto votou para separar, assim, com 90%. Foi tipo uma votação Belém 90%, Tapajós e Carajás 90%, cada um seguindo o seu interesse, assim. É muito doido aquele negócio. É uma coisa que ninguém olhou ainda.
É tipo o Brexit, London votando...
É tipo o Brexit, Mas só que como o Belém tinha muito mais gente, acabou ficando igual. Mas regionalmente foi bizarro.
That's muito bacana. Assim, eu acho bem legal, assim, a linha de pesquisa da Leila com o Rafael e a sua também, Rafael. Acho que é bem legal, assim, de ter.
Meu paper ficou super
eu também gosto das de vocês.
Vocês são do meio ambiente, me jogaram pô, paper de votação, political science aqui, o negócio
Assim,
zero
quando eu vi
economia.
inicialmente, eu falei, eu acho que isso aqui deve ser alguma coisa porque tem muitos papers de votação que usam como o efeito, a variação exógena de temperatura, de chuva, né? Tipo, choveu, entendeu? Então, assim, o que é que acontece na participação dos eleitores? E isso nos Estados Unidos prevê muito bem, né? Quem
É o
participa.
paper do Tomás, é o paper do Fujiwara. Ele faz isso. Ele faz habit formation com chuva. Choveu no precinct lá,
O
era
Tea
com
Party nos
professor.
Estados Unidos, né? Tipo, tem aquele paper no QJ que mostra que o Tea Party, ele cresceu nos lugares que não choveu no dia do movimento, né?
Esse paper é muito legal, do André Madestan, eu acho.
Eu falei, deve ser por isso, mas de qualquer maneira é interessante. É um paper muito interessante.
Pode ser uma ideia aí para continuar, né? Usar o negócio da chuva e
Pode ser, né?
ver se muda
Pegar
o
um
efeito
medidor na
dependendo
sessão.
do...
Interage chuva com voto obrigatório, vai interagindo um monte de custo ali em cima do voto de votação do cara.
Essa é uma coisa interessante. Imagina no mesmo estado, né, um município vizinho ao outro, numa eleição presidencial ou de governador, né? Que o comparecimento é diferente no município e de repente eles pegam menos verbas no futuro, né? Tipo, porque talvez um candidato ganhou ou não ganhou por causa disso, né? Isso assim, eu acho que assim, os seus dados de microdados de votação, você deve fazer muitas perguntas, tem muitas perguntas para você, acho que é uma linha assim de décadas de
A intenção foi essa, o investimento de encher o saco dos caras do TSE foi esse. Eu falo muito com o Meloni e o Alex, que estão portando no meu PP de Covid comigo lá, estava na sessão anterior, que hoje em dia a academia tem uma coisa muito quase de empresa, né? Você consegue uma base de dados e você monta uma série de papers em cima daquela base, respondendo perguntas importantes, assim. A impressão que eu tenho é essa.
Uma coisa que eu queria te falar, o François e meu former advisor, David Card e o Lourenço, a gente está olhando nessa questão da divisão dos recursos de campanha eleitoral, né? Tipo, para ver até que ponto aumenta a representação ou não. E naquele caso, você tem os dados das pessoas, né, que foram candidatas. Você tem o CPF que você consegue juntar com a RAIS. Tipo, a gente consegue juntar com a RAIS isso para ver. Então, assim, quando você consegue juntar com a RAIS, você consegue pegar os dados de raça, né? Tipo, que você não teria.
Sim.
E assim, você tem toda a declaração de renda deles também, né? Tipo, para poder ser candidato. Seria, se você conseguisse juntar essas coisas também. Por isso que eu perguntei do CPF, porque o CPF seria, você consegue juntar uma série de coisas.
Eu vou conferir com eles.
Talvez o título também talvez consiga juntar com esse, né? Com essa base de dados que é aberta, né? Tipo, esses dados
o título eu sei que eu consigo juntar com algumas pessoas do cadastro único, porque no cadastro único você pode usar o título para se cadastrar.
Mas então, para quem for candidato?
A pessoa tem que declarar o título. Se eu conseguir CPF, eu consigo tudo do cara, mas
não,
eu consigo o título. Consigo, tem na base o título. Lembrei agora.
Não, se você tiver o título, você deve conseguir juntar com a base de candidatos, né? Para poder...
E acho que para ele deve ser super tranquilo isso.
Porque eu acho que você pode ver, por exemplo, representação, sabe? Por isso que eu perguntei para você de gênero, porque essa é uma coisa que está na lei, né? Que as mulheres têm que ser representadas accordingly, né? Tipo, na distribuição dos recursos. Que não foi cumprido, mas, enfim, tem Por exemplo, você vê que mais mulheres... tipo, quando eu estava no Brasil ainda, gente, imagina, isso faz muitos anos, que eles começaram a falar sobre isso. Eu tinha uma tia que se candidatou a vereadora só porque eles precisavam ter gente de mulher de candidatar a vereadora.
Absurdo.
Tipo,
Não, é um absurdo.
Ela não fez a menor campanha, nunca saiu na rua fazer nada, entendeu? Foi simplesmente para poder ser candidata, para poder ter a quantidade, a proporção de mulheres naquele partido, sabe? Tipo, é meio bizarro, mas se você consegue ver essas coisas, até que ponto, né? Tipo, tem representação ou não. Assim, o que a gente está tentando ver no nosso caso, é ver se a representação de quem entra na política com esse tipo de recurso é realmente quem não tem recursos, entendeu? Tipo, você consegue pegar pela raiz, e se as pessoas, sabendo agora que vão ter a campanha pública, né, o financiamento público, você pode trazer um perfil de candidatos que é bem diferente, né? Tipo, do que você tinha antes, né? E é uma coisa que nos Estados Unidos tem pessoas têm debatido a todo momento, né? Porque o que você vê é que os ricos estão bancando as próprias campanhas, ou pelo menos o começo das campanhas, né? Então, você muda completamente o perfil de gente que está se candidatando, né? Assim, a gente começou isso mais pela questão da coisa de raça, que é onde eu gosto de ver esses
É o paper que vocês de Inequality, que eu acho super legal.
Então, assim, tem essa questão de... A gente tem mais interesse na parte de racial inequalities, e mesmo também na parte de politics, assim, né? Tipo, por isso que a gente se interessou um pouco naquele assunto, mas assim, se você tem os dados de título, acho que você consegue juntar com essas informações que eu acho que são públicas, mesmo o título. Que a gente conseguiu...
Não, os candidatos é público. Os candidatos é tudo público.
Então, você consegue até ver, assim, até que ponto essas pessoas... Você consegue ver se eles mudaram também, né? Na sua base, você consegue ver se eles mudaram, né? Tipo, para se candidatar em outro lugar.
Não, e para se candidatar para lugar, o cara vai ter... Eu sei que é binding ele mudar de título.
Exato. Então, assim, você consegue ver essas coisas, né? Tipo, o Edinho Araújo foi prefeito de Rio Preto, meu Deus do céu, ele cresceu, toda a política dele foi feita em Santa Fé do Sul, que é uma cidade, sei lá, 200 quilômetros mais para frente. Tipo, de repente ele é prefeito de Rio Preto? Como assim, né? Tipo...
Eu acho que o exemplo mais simbólico é o Zé Sarney, que foi senador do Amapá, eu acho. Né?
Meu Deus. Política estratégica, né? Localização estratégica. Bom, enfim, vou deixar vocês irem, que eu também preciso.
Eu também vou. Pessoal, prazer o trabalho de vocês, hein? Muito obrigado pelos comentários.
Valeu, gente.
Valeu. Parabéns pelo trabalho aí, vocês do doutorado do INSPER, que tá... Só tô vendo paper bom saindo daí.
Tá ótimo.
Tá legal.
Obrigada.
Valeu.
Parabéns para vocês também.
Parabéns também.
Tchau.
Finalizar a reunião, tá bom?
Já pode finalizar. Obrigado.
Nada.